typically my highest volume month of the year. As a teacher, I have, they say summer's off. It's not June, July, August, but I get the end of May to the third week of July off. So June is a month where I'm totally off. And unlike a lot of Junes, I didn't travel a whole lot this year. I'm saving up for a couple of international trips next year. So I took a quick trip to visit some family in Ohio, and that's it. So I got a lot of reading done. I finished 14 books in June across a wide variety of genres. As with all of these kind of monthly wrap-up videos where I do these short reviews, I will group the reviews below. Since there are so many books this month, and I'm going to just start doing this going forward, if any of the categories have more than one book of the chapters below, I'll put that in there somewhere there so that, like, for instance, when I get to science fiction, I read 2 things of science fiction, I'll put that in there just in case you're someone that might be skipping around, that you don't miss any of the books, because I read some really great books. Only one of them can be Book of the Month. Okay, let's get started with Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. This is the latest read in my reread of all of King's short fiction. I'm putting together videos. I'm calling it my Stephen King short fiction project. This will be the 4th one. So those of you looking for the full kind of treatment of this volume, that'll be out probably next weekend. But Skeleton Crew is a very strong collection of short stories. There's 20 or 22 short stories here, and most of them are horror. But he does dabble into some other things. I mean, most of King's output is horror or magical realism. But there's a really good science fiction story in here that I really enjoyed called The Jaunt. I got done with that one and I was like, I was thinking, Steve, Mr. King, stop writing all of this frankly mediocre crime fiction. Write some science fiction. This was really good. Anyway, I really enjoyed that story. There's some great horror in here as well. There's one called Grandma, which is a younger kid. His mysterious grandmother's dying in the next room, and of course there's going to be some horror elements there. There's a really good one called The Raft, which is some teenagers are kind of caught on a raft, and there's a creature that's keeping them from getting to the shore. That one is just vintage King. And then the story in here called Survivor Type was my favorite, and it's actually King's favorite short story. I saw an interview with him recently where he called that his favorite short story. And Survivor Type is, we'll just say that it's a person on a deserted island doing anything they can to survive. Anyway, really strong collection. I don't think it's at the level of Night Shift. I don't think Night Shift had any bad stories. This had a couple that weren't quite as good as the others, but overall, really strong collection of short fiction. I definitely recommend Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. Up next, I read a really great memoir called Every Falling Star by Sungju Lee, and this is a story of a North Korean defector. But it's not the typical story. It's not really about the defecting. It's more about this horrible life that this young man lived in North Korea before he did defect. The story unfolds with his family becoming destitute during the famine. And his father leaves the house and ends up trying to go to China to sell some of their goods for money to buy food. Never comes back. A few weeks later, because the family is so destitute, the mother tries to go to another city to get some relatives to try to get food. She never comes back. This 8-year-old boy's on his own. And he ends up living in the streets. He's homeless. He's begging and stealing and just trying to do anything he can to survive. And then eventually he does survive and he just becomes part of some street gangs. And that's really the bulk of this book, is his just life living on the streets, just trying to survive. And it's harsh. And the author doesn't shy away from the harsher elements of this story. And it makes it, honestly, it's a tough read. It's a really harrowing tale. And it's real, which makes it tough. When I got through this book, I thought, is there anything worse in this world than child poverty? Just hearing about this poor boy just living through what he lived through. I also like that at the end, he didn't shy away from how it's not just like he defects, he's in South Korea, light bulb moment, life is good. Just how he struggled kind of reintegrating into society. Of course, North Korea and South Korea couldn't be more different, but also this poor boy that he lived on the streets for so many years, just reintegrating into regular society. And then you get the glimmers of hope where you see just the life that he eventually made for himself. It's pretty inspiring. Very, very strong memoir. I really recommend it. It's one of the best nonfiction works that I've read in 2025. So you know how when you have a spreadsheet and you type in something that in that column has already been filled in, it kind of auto-populates for you. So I type in all my reviews after I write them and put them into a spreadsheet. And one of the columns of that spreadsheet is genre. And I was typing for this book, historical fiction, and it didn't auto-populate. And I was appalled. I consider historical fiction my number 2 favorite genre to read. And my first work of historical fiction I read in 2025 was in June. So I got to try to fix that in the last half of the year because I do love historical fiction, although the numbers might not represent that this year. Anyway, the book that I read was The Forts by Bernard Cornwell. So thank you, Heidi. Heidi sent this to me from my Amazon wish list. Bernard Cornwell is one of my favorite authors in this genre. This is my 13th book that I've read by Cornwell, and I consider him a very consistently strong author. Unfortunately, this one doesn't stack up to his best works. The biggest issue with this book is actually its subject. So The Fort is about a battle during the Revolutionary War. If you're not American, I don't know what they call it in your country. Maybe it's the American revolt against the British. The British maybe ungrateful colonials fight back. I don't know what they call it in your country, but it's the American Revolution is what we call it here. And this is a story set in the American Revolution, but it's a story it's not an important battle, and it's not an eventful battle either. So at this point in the war, most of the war was in the southern colonies. And while this was going on, a troop of it was actually mostly Scottish soldiers, but a troop swoops into the Massachusetts colony and takes over kind of some of the shipping lanes. And then the colonials fight back, and they drive them into this fort, which the British call Fort George. And it's basically a siege, and they lay siege for 19 days, but for 19 days they kind of didn't do anything. Like there's the initial battles that get all of the British into this fort, and then they just kind of look at each other because the British realize that they're outnumbered and outgunned, so they're just sitting and waiting. While the colonials, the Americans, the commander doesn't realize that they have the upper hand, and he's afraid to attack. So they just kind of sit there for 19 days, for like 300 pages. And then finally the battle resolves and the book's over. So it's odd because this wasn't an important tactical advantage or anything in the war. So I'm really unsure why Cornwell picked this as his subject for a novel, because it's kind of a unimportant and uneventful battle. And I have to rant about something. And this isn't against Cornwell. So, we get the cover matter. I don't know if they call it blurbs or whatever they call it. Essentially three paragraphs which tell you about this book and try to entice you to read this book. And in the second paragraph here, it tells you who wins the battle. So by the nature of this, I would assume that, okay, well, that must happen early in the book, and maybe the fallout is the important part of this book. But no, the battle resolves itself. The battle where it tells you right here who wins the battle resolves itself on page 430 out of a 450-page book. How is that right? How did the person who wrote this from Harper not get fired for that? Because basically this is the Cliff's Notes version of the book. It's 3 paragraphs, and it tells you the second paragraph tells you the middle 350 pages of the book, and the last paragraph tells you the last 20 pages. Appalling. I'd usually gravitate away from these things, but for some reason I read this one, and I have to admit that did unfortunately affect my reading. So actually, if you look at my Goodreads rating, my actual feeling on the book, I think because of this blurb, was lower than that. I gave it like a star higher just because it was Cornwell, and I thought that maybe me knowing the end of the battle and this 300 pages where nothing was going on being so unsuspenseful that perhaps that I was just negatively disposed towards this book because of the blurb. So I got to go back to no longer reading any more blurbs because this was appallingly bad. If this weren't a book that were 14 years old, I would be emailing and just slamming HarperCollins on their socials right now because this is appalling, and I hope that whoever wrote this blurb didn't write another one because it was horribly done and in many ways negatively affected my enjoyment of The Fort by Bernard Cornwell. I read a couple of works of science fiction last month, including Tempus by Thomas Botea. The author sent this to me well over a year ago when I was in a position to still take review requests. I can't do those, unfortunately, right now because my TBR is just overwhelming. But I did get this maybe 2 years ago, a year ago, I'm not sure. But I finally got to reading it. It's a science fiction novella, and it's a really fast-paced story. And it has to do with time travel. And I thought that alone I would be very interested in it. But I had a big issue with this book in that the time travel, there was no explanation how it worked. And I kind of think, the more I think about time travel stories, almost every time travel story I've ever read, you kind of understand it. You understand how the time travel works in this kind of story, whether it's something I've watched or read. And what was happening is there were so many elements which were, I wouldn't say confusing, but I would say that they were unclear how the elements in this science fiction story, the science, were working, that I kept getting pulled out of the story and kept asking myself, well, how's this work? How's this working? How does this affect what we just saw in this scene? And for me, reading is really about immersion, and I had no immersion in the story because I kept getting pulled out with things that I wish the author would have told me about. The other thing is I think the pacing actually, fast-paced can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And I think in this story, it actually hurt the story because I felt zero connection with the characters. There was zero development with the characters. And I think there were, unfortunately, a couple ideas in there that I thought might have been good had they been fleshed out a little bit more. But unfortunately, Tempus didn't work for me. Thank the author for sending that to me for an honest review, which I just gave you. So I also read Ashes of Man by Christopher Ruocchio last month. This is the 5th book in the Sun Eater, and this has an incredible ending. The last, not just the very ending, but the last 200 pages of this thing were incredible. We got a lot of kind of plot and story turns that went a lot of different directions, most of which I didn't see coming. There's one big event here that I kind of saw coming, but it actually was done so well, it didn't lessen my enjoyment of it. And it's an impactful moment that is going to I'd be shocked if it doesn't affect the last 2 books tremendously. Just something big happens to Hadrian in this story at the end that can't help but just change this series differently at the end. So I really love the ending of this one. Of the 5 books, I thought this had the strongest ending and had me very excited to continue. That said, I feel the series is bloated. I started feeling this in Demon in White. I felt that book, the story didn't support a 900-page book. And I've really felt it these last 2 books, Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man, which I was told were originally one story. And I think they would have been better as one story with, frankly, about 300 pages cut. Because I do feel that there's just a lot of bloat here. This is one of the rare occurrences for me where I often love, one of the things I loved early in this series, especially in Howling Dark, was kind of the philosophical questions that Ruocchio was bringing to the series. And in most series, when those philosophical questions are explored more deeply, I connect with them even more and become even more intrigued. But for some reason in this series, I'm becoming less interested in them as they get deeper and more layered, which is kind of surprising to me. So a lot of those aspects were explored in both of these books, and the whole time I was thinking, can we just get through this and get past this? So kind of a mixed bag. I'm still very positive on the series. I'm still enjoying my time, but I do feel the series has gotten bloated. I am a little nervous for the last book because I heard that it's over 1,000 pages. So I hope that it warrants that length, but I'm still enjoying my time. I love the end of this book. I do have 3 reads of Sun Eater up in the next 3 months, short stories, novella, and the 6th book, and look forward to continuing and finishing the series this year. So about 15 years ago, I started something where I read a big classic every summer, and in the last 6 summers, it's turned into my annual Dickens read. And the one that I read this summer was Martin Chuzzlewit, which has just a funny name, and it's one of the least known Dickens novels, I think, because when I originally decided I wanted to read everything by Dickens, this was one of the ones where I had absolutely no idea what the book was. I'd never heard of it at all. Even some of the lesser known ones like Old Curiosity Shop or Pickwick Papers, there's kind of a name recognition, but Martin Chuzzlewit, there's not much of a name recognition. So this is the last of the, they call it the picaresque stories of Dickens, the first 6 novels, which for me, I just translate that into, frankly, meandering, because these stories they just weave around. But one consistent thing that Dickens does very well, and he does it very well here, is he does give you a really good ending. And the ending of this was very strong and very memorable. The thing that I'll remember most about these first 6 novels is that they're not focused. They do meander from place to place, but there's still a lot of really great things in there. Pickwick Papers, despite being one of my least favorites, is memorable to me. Some of these just events are just in my brain. Barnaby Rudge, not one of my favorites. Tremendous ending. Old Curiosity Shop. The thing I'll remember from that is there's a single chapter in there that is one of the best things Dickens has ever written. So there are things in all of these that I like, but they're probably more for a Dickens completionist than anybody else. But Martin Chuzzlewit, one of the things I'll remember with this one is the side story that goes into America. And one of the characters takes a trip to America to maybe make his fortunes and then come back to England. And what's most notable is that it's obvious that Dickens hated America. He hated Americans because everything with that side plot is so negative and so scathing. And I mean, some of it is warranted, like it's Dickens, so great social commentary. There's a line in there about how Americans scream about their freedom, but they're like the only major nation in the 1840s that still had slavery, so I mean there's some warranted malice there, but it was obvious that Dickens just hated America. But what's interesting is in the afterword of this book, which was written a couple decades later, he talks about how he took a second trip back to America, met some great people, has a different thought on the nation as a whole. I don't know if he was backtracking or all that was true, but he said that he would insist that that was for every future publication of Martin Chuzzlewit, that he'd have that afterward, that he didn't hate America as much as it was portrayed in this story. And it's not a huge part of the story, but it is enough, and it was notable for me to think about. But again, I don't think Martin Chuzzlewit is something you should go out and search for if you're looking for Dickens works. I mean, there's a lot better out there. But I don't regret my time with it. I don't regret my time with these first 6 Dickens novels, but I am looking forward to kind of his later works that I haven't read yet. I got Dombey and Son, which is up next, followed by Hard Times and Bleak House. Seems like all of the Dickens scholars say Bleak House is his best book, so I got 3 years to that one. But I had a viewer recently tell me Dombey and Son was one of their favorite classics, so I look forward to reading that one next summer. So I read one other classic last month, and that is The Moon is Down by John Steinbeck. This is a pretty thin volume. This is really just a novella. And this feels unlike anything else by Steinbeck that I've read. This is the 12th work by Steinbeck that I've read. And while some of the books are not set, in his Salinas Valley, and I've read one of his nonfiction books, but out of the 12 I've read, this is easily the most different. This is a book that became a very important work of anti-Nazi propaganda. It was translated into many, many languages, distributed all across Europe and Italy. This was illegal to own. And it's a very interesting kind of story about the story. But The Moon is Down tells about a city in an unnamed nation who is occupied by an unnamed oppressor. And basically the ways that they deal with this and the ways that they ultimately fight back. And it's set in our world, obviously, and they mention England, but it's not really set in England, and both the oppressors and the oppressed speak the same language, so he's not real clear about any of that, like saying, oh, these are the Germans invading a village in France. It's not specific like that, but it is more universal. And I thought it worked really well. It's a very quick read. I mean, it's only a novella, and it's typical Steinbeck perfect prose. One of the stories that just unfolds, and as it gets in, you get more and more invested. But It's a different one from Steinbeck. I don't think it's essential Steinbeck, but I think if you're interested in just kind of the historic aspect of this, I think it's one you'll definitely enjoy. You could probably read it in under 2 hours like I did. But The Moon is Down by John Steinbeck was pretty strong. I enjoyed it. Two works of crime fiction this month. One was my biggest surprise of the month, and one was my biggest disappointment. Let's get the disappointment out of the way, and it is Never Flinch by Stephen King. I don't know why King just insists on writing crime fiction, because it's not his strength. I'll try to be brief because I could probably talk down on this book because of my personal disappointment for 10 or 20 minutes, to be honest. So let me just put it this way. I'm shocked. And I was shocked with this with Holly, one of his previous release, that an author of King's Talents who has written some of the most tension-filled, suspenseful stories I've ever read can write a work of crime fiction that's kind of a whodunit, kind of a murder mystery that is 100% bereft of suspension, 100% bereft of any tension, where I know at the beginning where it's going to go, how the stories are going to converge, and that everything's going to be okay. And that's not meant to spoil the ending, but this is, if I ever do a tier list ranking of Stephen King, I have my 5 tiers. The bottom tier is skip it. Unfortunately, that's where I put this one. But don't take my word for it. Take King's own word for it. In his afterword, he says that he finished the book and he gave it to his wife, and she basically said nope. And he rewrote a lot of it, and then he said he still wasn't happy with it, but it was good enough. I don't think it's good enough. I think this is, I joked on the Discord that King takes the thrill out of crime thriller, and it was easily my biggest disappointment of the month and the year. He's still a favorite author of mine, but I really wish that he would have went back to the drawing board, and frankly, I wish that he would stop trying to write crime fiction, because it's not a strength of his. Crime fiction is about those authors who are architects, not gardeners. He said that he plotted this story out, but it was so predictable. I marvel at, like, I don't know if you, where's my Connolly collection over here? You know, this guy gives me a plausible plot twist every time that I never see coming. And I saw every single story aspect of this coming in this book. Huge disappointment. I'm done talking about it. Never Flinch. Not one of King's best. Now, my big surprise of this month was Broken by Don Winslow. Not that I wasn't surprised that it was great, because I've read Winslow before. And the big surprise is this is 6 novellas, so it's essentially a collection of short fiction. And it absolutely impressed me. It absolutely blew me away. The thing that most impressed me was how Winslow changed his writing style based on the story. I marvel at authors that can do that. In fact, King does that really well. You got, early on, I'm reading these, you get one story that's crime noir, first person, stylized, writing style and dialogue, short and punchy, like, yeah, this is typical crime noir. You get another one that's like multi-POV, kind of more neutrally written. You get one that was dedicated to Elmore Leonard, that's totally infused with a lot of humor. I mean, just the diversity of these 6 stories in crime fiction was notable, and that really impressed me. Additionally, the last story made me emotional, and that's not something this genre does a lot for me. There are genres that bring out the emotions a lot more for me than crime fiction, but the last one I found myself quite emotional with that story. And additionally, it was just strong beginning to end. All 6 novellas are strong, absolutely. One little disclaimer with this. 3 of the stories here have tie-ins to previous works of Winslow. And these are actually works I haven't read, but I recognize them because I know the bibliography, because Winslow's a priority author for me. I plan on the next 2 or 3 years reading a lot of Don Winslow. So the books with Bobby V and Frankie Machine, the Dawn Patrol and the Savages books, some of those characters are in here. Now, it did not lessen my enjoyment, not really knowing their backstory. But I do suspect, at least in the case of one of the stories, that my enjoyment would have actually been enhanced had I read those previous books. I just want to put that out there in case someone reads this and comes back and says, hey, I never read Savages, I didn't want to learn about blah, 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 or whatever. So just wanted to throw that disclaimer out there. But anyway, this is a really, really strong collection of short fiction. I'm excited to read more Don Winslow this year and a lot more going forward. So I'm shooting my review of A Shadow of Summer before the rest of the video because as I'm filming this, I'm having a discussion tonight with John and Alan about the book. And I just wanted to make sure with my review, it was just my thoughts and I didn't accidentally incorporate some of their thoughts that we talk about on the chat in my review. So here goes. So I read A Shadow in Summer by Daniel Abraham this month. This is the first book of the Long Price Quartet. And I'm buddy reading this with John from Talking Story and Alan from the Library of Alexandria. And this is John and I, the first time we've read this. And this is a reread for Alan. And Alan's known as the Long Price Prophet because he's just been spreading the word of this series for many years here on BookTube. And I can see why initially, even though this first book does kind of feel like a setup book, I could tell right away that there are some things that I'm really going to enjoy. The first thing I really enjoyed about this book is I love when I experience a new author and I'm 50 or 60 pages into the story and I just realize that I really like the writing. And Abraham's he's not one of those writers where you're like, I wasn't blown away by the writing, you know, like when I read Kay or Hobb or something like that, but I thought it was very, very good. And it didn't draw attention to itself, but there was still just a level of quality there that I really, really liked. The second thing I really enjoyed about this is the world building. For me in the fantasy genre, I think that's why for so many years Tolkien was my number one, because I just love the world that he created there. And I was really impressed with the world building here. So the world here is very Eastern inspired, but it's not like a one-for-one, this is a fantasy world based in Japan or something like that. We get a lot of elements that lend to it being Eastern, like the architecture and the tea houses and things like that. But what I really liked most about the world building was the way that Abraham used language to inform the setting. And in this case, we have a language that has a lot of the like appellations that you might see in like an Asian language with like informal and formal address. But even more than that, I loved how he incorporated kind of high context language in this story. If you don't know that term, I didn't know that term until many years ago. The first time I went to Japan, when I was trying to learn a little bit about the language, I learned about high context versus low context languages. And high context languages, it's not just about the words that you say, but the way that you say them, your posture, your mannerisms, the things like that play into the communication just as much as the words do. And Abraham had a really interesting way of demonstrating in the world building how the language was high context, in that he would incorporate these poses. So for instance, somebody would say something and adopt a pose of apology. So instead of having to do like a paragraph of exposition about someone apologizing while saying something else, they could just say that they adopted this pose of apology. And it's a very succinct and very concise way of communicating. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And thinking of concise, this is only half of the book is only half of this. This is an omnibus edition. This first book is only 270 pages. And it just leads me, something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is that there's room for non-epic fantasy. Nothing against the big chunkers. I'm about to read Midnight Tides, which is like 700 pages, one of 10 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Don't get me wrong, I love epic fantasy, but I think there's a place. I don't think that every author needs to write a 700-page chunker installment in their series, because this was really, really solid at 270 pages. Now, I haven't watched any reviews of others, but I would guess a criticism for this book would be that it might be slow-paced. And the plot does move slowly, but I never mind a slow pace when I'm getting a lot more. In the case of this book, just the world building is fantastic. You get great character examinations, and you get kind of four main characters in this book. Three of them are younger. One of them is kind of a middle-aged woman. And all of them have kind of a narrative arc within this just small, concise storytelling. So plot-wise, I didn't love where the book ended, but I think it feels like it's a setup book, so I'm sure that it'll lead to bigger things. But really, really great start to a book series. We'll be reading one of these per month. If any of you want to jump in, it's easy to jump in because it's only 270 pages for book one. But I really enjoyed A Shadow in Summer, and I look forward to reading the rest of the books alongside John and Alan. All right, up next we have A Snake Lies Waiting by Jin Yong. Now, this is the third book in the Legend of the Condor Heroes, and this is considered kind of the Chinese Lord of the Rings. It's a 10-book series with 100 million, 300 million copies worldwide. So, pretty popular series. And I've enjoyed it for the most part. It's a very different kind of storytelling. Only 4 of the books have been translated in English at this point, so I'm just kind of slow rolling the series because there's no reason to keep up, because I'm just going to be waiting for the next installment. This installment for me wasn't as good as the first 2. And there's 2 big reasons why in this one I just think it fell short. And it's kind of 2 of the things that I haven't liked about the series. The first is characterization. I find it quite shallow. And I find character motivations to be either inexplicable or non-existent. Let me give you an example of a scene in this that leads me to that conclusion. So there's a kung fu master and he's fighting 7 opponents. And another master sees this and he jumps in. He was like, I will help you. And the first master says, no, I got this. Leave me alone. So the master who is going to help him says, well, I'll attack you then. And it's like, what? I mean, what is the motivation? What is going on? And that's not an isolated thing. It happens so often in this book, in this series, where people just flip a coin and change allegiances, at a whim. The other thing is in this one is, so it's common in fantasy novels that a lot of storylines will converge. And the good authors make it feel organic. Well, here it felt like a half dozen plot conveniences to get every single character, which there's a multi-page list of characters at the beginning of here, and it seems like every one of these characters ended up in this tiny little village at the end of this book at exactly the same time. And the first group gets there, is like, oh, we're just passing through, we're going to stop for this. And the next group, oh, we're just passing through, we're going to stop for this. And it's like, I mean, really? So, I mean, those 2 aspects really bothered me with this book. But not enough to not continue, because there are 2 things I really enjoyed with this series. The first is this feels 100% more unique than anything else that I think I've ever read in the genre. So I like that difference. I like that it just feels different from so many other things. And it's not that, there's not creativity in the fantasy genre, but this is just so far-flung different than anything else that I've read. The other thing is I still enjoy the way that Kung Fu, the martial art, is treated as kind of a magic system. And I find it inventive. I find it unrealistic at times, like the time where one character's kung fu is so strong that even though he's on the ground and he has 2 broken legs, he's fighting off 4 other masters at the same time. You have to suspend your disbelief quite a bit, but I still like that aspect of it. So I will just no time soon pick up the 4th book in the series, because again, the other 6 have yet to be translated. But A Snake Lies Waiting, a little bit of a mixed bag, but I will be continuing The Legend of the Condor Heroes. Up next, another continuation of a series that was not a mixed bag was The M Word by Jeff McIntyre. This is the sequel to The Garden Gnome. The series is called The Theory of Magic. This is a self-published series, and the author sent me this, and I'm really invested in this series at this point. One of the things I liked initially in the series, well, in both books, but I initially liked kind of the juxtaposition of it's a low fantasy setting. It's a modern world with magic coming back. So you kind of have a modern setting, and then you have magic coming back. Well, in the second book, magic is back, and you're seeing how different people are dealing with it. But what I really liked in this volume is that McIntyre leaned into kind of more of the world-building aspects of the story, notably that we have these entities that are kind of like gods or creatures or whatever you want to name them, that have been around centuries, thousands of years, that had other names like Zeus and Hera and Ares and things like that. And I loved how he leaned into kind of those characters, and you kind of see them for who they are and how their myths kind of became what they became. It's a really fast-paced read. I read this in like 2 sittings, probably like 2 2-hour sessions. I read this. If there's one thing that didn't work for me in this book, is that there's a lot of POVs, and I think some of them weren't super important. There were a couple like very minor characters that got 1 or 2 POVs that I think weren't necessary. But besides that, I'm really enjoying the series. I don't know. I mean, this just came out, so I'll have to be patient for the 3rd book. But whenever the 3rd book of The Theory of Magic comes out, I'll definitely be reading it. Another work of fantasy that I read this month was the first Chronicles of Druss the Legend by David Gemmell. This is the 6th book published in the Draenei saga, and this is a prequel to the first book, Legend. We met Druss in the first book, and he was an old man. This is kind of his coming-of-age story. And the structure of this is very, very interesting. It's written as book 1, book 2, like there's 4 books. But it's almost like it's 3 novellas and a short story. But they're also not like standalone novellas. So they're kind of linked, but not. It's hard to explain, but they do link more than they don't, because the first 3 novellas in particular have one focus, and that's Druss was young, his village was attacked, his wife was captured. And in those 3 novellas, he's trying to get her back from these slavers that have captured her. And this is heroic fantasy. And I loved the early portions of this, of Druss kind of finding his way, finding his philosophy in life. And you meet some really great secondary characters in here. But this is heroic fantasy, but even though it's heroic fantasy, there's still a lot of kind of grayer characters in here. So there's a lot more depth than just typical heroic fantasy that's very black and white. Because I think at least this 6th book here, there's a bit more nuance to Gemmell's writing than where he started. The only thing I didn't like about this is at the very end, normally Gemmell kind of wraps everything up with a bow and then gives you a page of kind of not falling action, but like, hey, here's what happened to this character, here's what happened to this character. Not only did the last book not really end this entire thing satisfactorily, there was no closure at the end. So I don't know if the next book in the series, which is The Legend of Deathwalker, which is another name for Druss, just continues with this left off, and that's why we didn't get that. That may be the case. But as it is, it's kind of a step down from some of the higher entries in this series, but I still really enjoyed my time with it. These Gemmell books are just enjoyable, and I just enjoy reading them. My book of the month is The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow. So this is technically a reread, but I don't think I appreciated this book as much the first time around for a couple reasons. The first reason is my whole life I've been in and out of genres where I get really excited for a genre and that excitement boils over, and sometimes I overdo it and then it kind of fades in the background as a new genre takes its place. I read this right at the tail end of a period where I was reading a lot of crime fiction. And I think I was just kind of tired and wanted to be reading other things. So I didn't appreciate this for the masterful work that it is. So The Power of the Dog is a story about a DEA agent trying to take down a Mexican cartel. And the level of detail makes it feel like it's a work of nonfiction. And the level of detail, I'll be honest, my parallel, what I thought about, I said, this feels like a Malazan book because of just the level of detail of all of the world-building elements, which, yes, they're kind of real world, but there's still world-building elements here. I was really in awe of this. So one of the other things with this, I'm pretty disciplined in many aspects of my life, one of which is when I read at night, I pretty much always shut it down between 9:30 and 10 because I need my sleep. And I'm not great when I don't get enough sleep. So I'm one of those people that, you know, if I'm reading and I get to the end of the chapter and it's like 9:30, I'm usually like, oh, I'm going to pack it in. This book made me stay up late like 3 nights in a row because I just couldn't stop reading it. I just wanted to keep going. It's got some great characters. It's storytelling tour de force. I'm so excited to read the sequels because I haven't read those. I'll be reading The Cartel. As I'm filming this, I'll be reading The Cartel probably next week, and then The Border next month, and I'm really excited to do so. But I'm so excited, having reread this, that I've chosen Don Winslow as one of my priority authors to read right now, because I was just blown away by both books of his that I read this month. But my book of the month for June 2025 is The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow. Hey, so that was my month. 14 books, a lot of great ones, a couple disappointing ones. How was your June? Let me know. Tell me your favorite book that you read in June. And if you want to talk about any of these books in the comments section below, I'd love to do so. Just please label any spoilers for anybody that hasn't read those books before. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.